Hi, everybody. Welcome to Salary Negotiations. We're going to
Is the reason we go to work every day, right? Unless you're Ashley. And I will tell you, there's a very dear friend of mine who Ashley knows, who she always told me she wanted to go to work at Home Depot. And I kept meaning she wanted to be the helper person at Home Depot. And I kept telling her, no, if you're going to work, you need to work where you can make the most money. And now ultimately I'm 100% certain she's going to quit her real job and go work at Home Depot. But it's a very important part of what we do and how we do it. And when you don't feel like you're fairly compensated for the work that you do, it can certainly impact how you perform and how you react and how you respond, particularly as it relates to, if you're asked to do something that's sort of beyond your scope, or the scope of your job creeps, which I'm sure a lot of us have had. It impacts your willingness to jump in, I believe, on some occasions. So it's a very important part of who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And being paid equitably for the work you do is super important, obviously. So
those are really good points. I think everyone's had those days. I'm not sure that anyone's ever like, oh, I get paid too much. I don't think anyone says that, but all the things y'all just said with all the moving parts. So how do you know if you're being paid fairly?
Yeah, that's a big one. I don't know, Debbie, do you want to
So
start?
I can start that. And y'all, by the way, if you have any specific questions for us, don't hesitate to drop them in the chat. And Cheryl and I will try to answer as many of those as we can. So there are different ways to determine if you're being paid equitably. Often we think that we should be paid more than we are, just in general. And there's a lot of tools and that sort of thing that you can use to kind of help determine that. Depending upon where you work, your organization likely has tools that they use. For example, there's a lot of compensation surveys. I mean, my firm uses a big one that really all the major firms participate in this particular survey. And it's very involved, and it's got job mapping, and it's got geo information, all the things that are really important about to help you determine how much you should be paid. Unfortunately, a lot of the tools that are out there aren't super accurate. For example, if you use, a lot of people go to Robert Half website. How much should I make? Well, Robert Half thinks you should make $27 million. And the agency side of that, often they inflate those numbers, because if you think of how they're compensated, if they place someone, agencies are paid based on base salaries. So the higher they can get your base salary, obviously the larger fee that they're going to get. So, I say that because you want to sort of take everything that you garner with a grain of salt. What you don't want to do is come in blazing and say, Robert Half says that I should be making 35% more than I am currently making, because that is likely not accurate. So whether it's Robert Half, whether it's the Mercer survey, whether it's talking to colleagues who are in similar organizations and similar roles, but sort of the main things that you need to consider are your location. Your geo is very important. Your experience is obviously important. What am I bringing to the table? And then, your actual role and responsibilities are also very important. What gets people tripped up sometimes as you're going through this is, if someone says, when we talk about salary transparency, if I say to Cheryl, I make $300,000 a year, and Cheryl says, well, gosh, I make 350. What neither individual knows is like what all went into that. Education, opportunity, experiences, Someone might be a lower performer. One person might be a lower performer than the other. And typically what you're not going to find is the person who's gotten some constructive feedback. They're not going to be typically not super forthcoming with, oh, by the way, I got I've gotten lesser increases because my performance may not have tracked as well. So I think all of those are ways to kind of help you determine what you should be making. But it can be a dicey conversation, which is one of the reasons why we're here. Cheryl, do you have anything to add to that? I feel like I babbled about that for quite a
No,
minute.
that was all really good points of kind of intake and what people should look at. You might have an organization that actually posts some structures. The transparency is a spectrum. The only other data point I would add is some states require that they post a pay range for a job. You may see, depending on the level of the job and where it's at, that range could vary by even $100,000. So again, these are all multiple inputs for you to kind of evaluate. And the reason for that wide, you know, band of pay depends on a lot of things. You might see people at higher level in the organization be at in that job or that level for a long time, so that range needs to accommodate a lot of different levels of experience or a lot of different levels of jobs. It might be something that an organization wants to simplify how they pay. And so maybe they've just got 5 bands and their whole organization is paid in there. That's a lot of nerding on what compensation structures are, but just to let you know, like it's very enticing to go on LinkedIn, look at a job, it's posted in Washington, and go, I can make $300,000, and then go, oh, that might not be realistic. So manage your own expectations.
I would add one quick thing to that too, and I don't know if the folks on this call, one of the big changes that I've seen over the last several years is I'm going to age myself, but back in the day, a very common question that we asked from a recruiting and an HR perspective is if we were interviewing a candidate or whatever, is what's your current salary? And that we can't ask that anymore. So if you are interviewing, don't answer that question. Because it's more about what the current position pays, not what you made or make. So you want to be super mindful of that. You want to know what that position pays, not what you make currently, or what you made is really not relevant to the situation at hand.
Debbie, I love that you said that. My dad always used to give me advice like, don't tell people what you make when you're interviewing. And this was long ago. And so I had to get tricky about how to answer that question because it was part of interviews. And you would say, like, I've always gotten really great raises. Like, that was the way to do it. So when we answer this next question, can you also kind of touch on if an interviewer asks that, what is a good response to that? So you don't feel like, oh my gosh, I have to tell them they just asked me and I want this job. And also, this is along the lines, but when's the best time to negotiate a salary?
Cheryl, you want to go?
Yeah. Um, I think, of course, when I'll kind of think about it as like the life cycle of an employee, and it's kind of when you're getting a job offer is a great opportunity to do that. Now, if you're doing that dance where if someone's asking you what your current salary is, and Debbie had shared, like, don't answer that question. Like, do your best not to answer that. I mean, they shouldn't be asking today, but you know, if you might encounter lots of different people who are asking you that. And maybe you can give a range if you're really pressed, but I would encourage you not to share that information and kind of more put the question back on, well, I'm looking at a different job. Tell me more about the range of pay for this job. So you might be comparing apples and oranges. So
And you don't want to do that. Typically, there's not a lot of compensation conversation during the first interview, depending upon what level you are, or what level you're interviewing for. That's typically, round 2, round 3. I would say if you are asked that question, to Cheryl's point, I would push back, but you want to push back in a way that, you know, I'm interviewing for a new role with a new organization. What is the range for that position? Because what you're also letting them know is that you know they're not supposed to be asking that question. But also, there are a lot of people that are interviewing throughout corporate America that don't know that. So you may run upon someone who's asking the question, which it's really not relevant. It's not relevant.
Yeah.
Some of the other points to negotiate your salary, of course, is during performance reviews where you might be getting some compensation either based on performance or time and role, depending on your organization, kind of merit-based increases. Anytime you're having a promotion discussion, like a new opportunity might be available either in your own role, and so you're getting expanded responsibilities. That's a time to talk about pay, of course, or if you've applied for something internally too. And then anytime you've kind of had a major accomplishment, you've added some more value to the organization, you've probably developed your skills through that a little bit more. It's time to open the door for maybe some more moolah on the table.
Timing is everything with that, y'all. You know, you want to pick a good moment to have those conversations, and obviously you want to be very well prepared. We've got some great questions
I
in
was
here.
just going to say, we've got to take a break, but I also love what you all just said, that you're the one that has to bring up the raise, right? Okay, so Debbie, do you want me to read these questions for y'all, or do you want to handle that going down? I don't know what's
I
easier
don't
for
know,
you.
Cheryl, you however you all want to do it. This is
Or
y'all's
do you
time.
want to
So,
wait till, yeah, do you guys want to, let's answer a couple now, because like you said,
okay.
they're really good. What if your geographic responsibility changes from a region to a state, or from a regional to a state role? I think this goes back to, and feel free to jump in, homemade Atlanta. If I think that goes to, because the salaries are different across the country. If you're put into a new geography, when should you bring that up?
Good question. I can use myself as an example.
Awesome.
I sit in Charlotte, North Carolina. Most of my client base that I support is on the West Coast. So I have California, highly compensated area. I've got Washington State, same. I've got, Portland, Oregon. So, smattering all over, but towards the West Coast. So in general, those geolocations pay more than North Carolina does, or than Charlotte does. So unfortunately, and I actually had this exact same conversation with an employee just the other day, y'all, and I'll share a little bit about that with you. Unfortunately, I get paid based on where I sit, not where I work. So one thing really doesn't impact the other. Now, again, if your role is creeping and that sort of thing, that's a different conversation. But just if you're working in Atlanta and now you're working in San Francisco, but you live in Atlanta, in general, your comp is going to be tied to Atlanta. For example, the employee that I had a conversation with the other day, this employee was hired into our San Francisco office, then moved to Sacramento, which is a very different geo from, a compensation perspective. And she wanted to know why she couldn't be paid the same since, she was in San Francisco. Why can't she be paid the same? And it was very difficult for me to make her understand that it's based on your cost of living. Sacramento is clearly a much lower cost of living than San Francisco. So your compensation is tied to your home address, not the office that you go to.
Well,
And
and just for clarification, it's I'm Mandy with Homemade Atlanta. Well, Homemade Georgia now. So we were Homemade Atlanta, so we had about a 10-county footprint, and now we're Homemade Georgia, so we're covering the whole state. And I had some conversations about that, and I got a small increase, merit increase, sort of normal kind of increase. But I'm just wondering if there was. Sorry, now my dogs want to talk to you. A conversation to be had further about, okay, now I'm doing the whole state. What does that mean?
which is different. That is very different. That's job creeping, Mandy. So your role is larger, you're covering a broader area, which is different than taking on, in my situation where I'm my client base is on the other side of the country. So in your situation, I would, because of the creeping in your role, I would absolutely expect that you would, could bring that up in a well-informed and educated manner.
So let's jump to that question below. I promise I'm coming up to get them. Somebody asked, how do you prepare for that? Like, what is some advice if they're going to go ask for a raise or figure out the right salary? What can people be looking at to come armed with education on what their salary should be?
I can start. I think first of all, and you kind of alluded to it in asking the question, prepare yourself. Don't like fly off the handle in a meeting and talk about pay. Get all of your ducks in a row. So we talked a little bit about where you can go find some data points about what is happening in the market. You might have conversations with other people internally that might help inform you, but get all your data. And then you start looking at what is your role, and maybe how, as we've just heard in this example, how your responsibilities have changed. That's a great kind of point to consider. Also, what is the value that you have been bringing to the organization? And that kind of leads back to the conversation that we had the last time we were together. How have you tracked some of your accomplishments? Maybe you have some quantifiable value that you have brought to the organization. And so get a lot of that together. Maybe you've made other leadership impacts. You've taken on bigger projects. So get all of that together, and then want you to schedule a meeting very specifically to talk about compensation. When you're meeting with your manager or whomever makes these pay decisions, it's not a good idea to catch them off guard, because they'll want to prepare for that discussion too. And maybe they have to get some data, or they have to get into HR or that sort of thing. Maybe they're just going to listen and be open to maybe not getting an answer right away, because these things may have to be negotiated. But practice your pitch ahead of time with someone else about the value that you're bringing, the data points that you have there, and kind of make your case for what it could be, and what you're seeking. I wouldn't make it personal, like I bought a new car, so I'm going to need a raise. That that is not the organization's business, and that's not a great way to justify an increase. But if you look at all this and then you can afford your new car, that's great. That's a great outcome. Debbie, what else would you add?
Yeah, I think for a big part is your historical performance. So, you've had, I've been rated strong for the last 3 years and my raises have been this. I would really like to be at this amount based on my research, based on my contributions, based on my past performance, which is indicative of future performance. So you want to make sure that you include all of that in any of your big wins, which I think Cheryl mentioned. What are those additional tasks that you took on? What are those additional responsibilities that you've done? Mandy's example is a great example of how you would want to self-advocate for an increase. So I think, those are some things that I would consider.
The other data point I want to share is, if you've been at your organization for a while and you're getting performance increases, and you might be sometimes a very strong performer, maybe you're in the middle and meeting expectations, you bring a lot of value to the organization with your experience. But the math is you're probably being paid below the external market. And so that can be woven in a little bit in your pitch about the value that you bring to the organization. And then in the back of your head, no, it's going to cost them a lot of money to replace you and your knowledge. That doesn't have to be overt in your pitch, but just know that that's something important about your own value. And you should strongly consider, if you've been at your organization for a while, to have that conversation, because you could leave and probably get 20% just laterally in a new job because of the way the market has been, and how people need to entice people to fill external roles. So, fun fact.
Fun fact. So Cheryl and Debbie, are you guys good still answering questions over here? We might have to have a third portion of this series because there's a lot of questions. Are y'all good with us going down some more questions real quick?
Yeah.
However y'all want to go with this, we're here for y'all. So
It's a
I would
great
say
conversation.
whatever the group wants, let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. All right. So, is it ever appropriate to point out inequitable pay by bringing up another colleague's salary when negotiating your own, especially if you know the other person is being paid more for the same job?
So I'm not a fan of that. Now, Cheryl might have a different position on that, but I certainly wouldn't start with that because it goes back to my original comment about you don't know all there is to know about the other person and why that person is being compensated, differently than you. This person could have been hired in higher, education could be different, experience could be different. There's a lot of different things that could be different other than just compensation. So I would be careful in how I use that information, particularly at the onset. Cheryl, what about you? Do you think?
Yeah, I think the same thing. It's part of your own personal database about how you're getting information, and it's one of many points. But I wouldn't necessarily bring that up. And it kind of, people can, we can't prevent people from talking about pay. And there was a time when companies didn't want people talking about, like they would absolutely say you shouldn't be talking to each other about your pay. And some of that, is just in the water, shall we say, a little bit more. So you don't want it to like sully your reputation or the reputation of the other person. But it's in the back of your mind. But like Debbie said, you don't know all of the details that go into that.
And I can share a little bit personal experience about that when I was way younger and got hired. And Debbie knows this because we used to work together. But I got hired at a very high level for a position. But I'll tell you what the company did the very next year was a 1.9% raise. I'll never forget it in my life because in public accounting, you don't get 1.9%. But that company knew they needed to hook people in that position. And then they level it back out. Like over time, the companies know exactly what they're doing. So I just share that with a lot of people like, hey, you might come in really high, but they will even it out, or they might hire someone high, but at some point. Somebody asked, Millie, how do you broach this without sounding like you're desperate or greedy when you think you deserve a raise?
I would say it goes back to leading with your accomplishments and the value that you bring. And other things that can go into that are, when was your last increase? How much was it? But I think leading with your strengths to justify the value that you bring to the organization is way more compelling than anything that might seem like you're being a victim of whatever. And I think you need to position yourself from a place of strength. Debbie, would you add anything there?
I think that's a great response.
I'll give a little more information around that. So I was very much going, and this was years ago, and a prior employer and everything. I was very much going through women's leadership training, and I was hearing all this: document your metrics, like keep track of your accomplishments. I don't know if you've heard of Landit, but it was a Landit course, and so I was like, I gotten awarded to go through this training. And so I started doing that, and I started bringing it up, and I started, making it sort of part of conversation, and it all completely backfired to the point where I literally had to show my boss how I was told to do all these things. And because I got we all work hard, nobody wants to hear it. And, it's like, so there are some folks out there that you can tell them that you just saved the company $50 million in grants, for a compliance issue.
Yeah.
They don't care. That you just did your job. Congratulations. Like, so when you get that kind of feedback, like, where do you go from there?
Yeah.
Maybe elsewhere. Let me just
Well, that does tell you something. I mean, plus they may have, sponsored you for the Landit, and then they don't like what you learned, but because that's hard. I think you need to balance what would be kind of what I should be doing in my job. And the things that you can point to are your job description or your goals and that sort of thing. And then inquire back to the goal setting, what would it look like if I really exceeded the expectations? And those are the things that might help you make a case, because we are all working hard, we're all having a lot of great accomplishments, but then what are the things that really make you stand out? um might deliver, yeah, like you saved a bunch of money, or you've delivered like 2 earnings per share or something like that to the company, like really big stuff. And then if you're not getting anywhere, I think, Millie, that's the point where you go, is this the place for me? Like,
Yeah,
or and
you
maybe
just
it's not right
gaslighted
now, or I
me.
start looking.
Just be aware that there are people that will gaslight you and
Yeah,
basically be like, okay, that was great, but no,
yeah,
like you can do better. Like,
yeah.
Better
okay.
at a new job, right,
But
Millie?
Millie, I think
Right.
I think I think there's a message in that. And it's important to be able to read those hidden messages.
Yeah. And one of the messages in there is that person might not be equipped or comfortable having any pay conversations, and this is how they get rid of it. It makes, for all the reasons we discussed, people really uncomfortable, and people don't want you to leave. They don't want you to feel X, Y, or Z. So those people exist out there too.
Yeah,
So
I'm sorry I had to bring that up only because it's like
yeah,
I must have PTSD still. I don't know.
that's okay. It happens. Like
Now
that.
you're in therapy. This is your therapy session. You're good.
It has been for 5 years, you guys. Juan was my therapy.
Um, so one more quick question here, and then back to regular scheduled programming, I think. There's a lot of transplants coming up here to Virginia housing area from New York City, DC, since COVID, and now there's remote work. Are you all seeing companies reanalyze the regional pay because of this? Because now Kay is saying housing prices and all prices are going up in that area comparatively, but it sounds like maybe pay is not going up at the same rate. So how often do companies revisit that, and what are y'all seeing?
I can start. Most companies look at their pay on an annual basis, but like Debbie was talking about, if they're using maybe Mercer surveys or other surveys, the time to participate in the survey and get the survey, like it takes a while. So then you have to age the data. So all that to say, like, even if you are getting data, we live in such a dynamic economy, shall we say, especially in the last 5 years since COVID. That's maybe some of that's a little off, but not like leaps and bounds off. Um, but here's the thing, your job location is based on cost of labor in that market. So, North Carolina, I'll use Debbie as an example, it has a cost of labor. That includes cost of living, but kind of the more simplistic way to look at it is, with cost of living, what are people generally being paid for in this area? So there isn't necessarily a like one-to-one index that we raise the pay ranges because housing is more expensive here. It eventually catches up, but you'll also see other things in the market happen. Gosh, 2021 and 2022, anyone could go anywhere and go, I need a 40% raise. And people go, yep, we need you. And then today, that is not the case. And so it can change so quickly. So it's super dynamic. But I do see that companies are looking at the remote work. There's also, you'll see the trend of we want people to be in the office. So that depends on the culture of the companies and kind of how they're going to position themselves. It's kind of an employer's market right now. So the tides will change. Debbie, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all great. I I see if you look at I read an article the other day, and in 21, 22, many of the positions posted on LinkedIn were remote positions. Now they are significantly less. And that goes back to Cheryl's point. A lot of organizations are bringing people back into the office. So, that's certainly an impact. So, I think with the question being, um, is there an opportunity, do we think that that's going to change? I personally don't see that particular change. I think it goes back to making sure that you're aware what the market is doing. If right now, to Cheryl's point, we're in an employer market. So, organizations aren't throwing money around like they were a couple years ago, when it was an employee market. So making sure you understand which market you're in will be an important part of the exercise when you're trying to negotiate, an increase.
That makes sense, and that's always good to hear. I think we all straighten up a little bit more. Like, it's an employer market. What? I gotta behave a little bit. I'm going to tie this next question into back to our programming. So, if your company has a set percentage, is there a way ever to negotiate that, or is it just is what it is? And what if they say they can't afford the raise that you're asking for?
Great question. I would say it depends on the size of the organization. Most larger companies and larger organizations have some sort of salary bands. I'm not so much familiar, Cheryl might have more experience around this, with, a percentage for a promotion. Again, that's usually an area that we would see a range, and depending upon all the other factors that we've talked about, performance, your geolocation, all those things, when your last raise was, would impact that increase. So I think that's an important piece about that. And I just lost my whole train of thought, y'all. I apologize. Cheryl.
Yeah, I can add, I've had experience where in tough economic times that hey, depending on your performance and where you are in the range, we might give you X percentage, and that percentage might be, it's like 5 to 7%, like super material. I've also experienced in tough economic times that goes out the window, and we're like, everyone's getting 2%, and just that's the way it's got to be. And that can happen on occasion, and as long as you're feeling like you're in an okay place, there probably aren't, in those conditions, a lot of other jobs to go to, so there might not be a lot you can do. That's like more extreme, like a 2008 scenario than what we're dealing with today. But if they can't afford raises, there are other options. And while we're talking about like basically base pay, there are a lot of other elements to your total compensation that you should be considering. Like, how much are they paying for your benefits? Do you have 401k, and is that a match? Is there variable pay, bonuses, and that sort of thing within your compensation package? There could be also maybe non-monetary benefits, like, can I have another few days off of vacation, or maybe it's off the books? Could there be a time in the future, like in 3 or 6 months, that we revisit this conversation? So there could be some future timing to consider. Also, are there ways that the organization can support your training and development in a new way? That's another line item on their P&L that they might have budget for that doesn't impact salaries. There could be other creative ways, if your leader is open to it, that you might be able to come to something where there's a win-win. There could also be one-time bonuses. Sometimes maybe there's the end of a particular project, there's a clear end, and so maybe there's a bonus that comes with that. Or there can be retention bonuses if you're super valuable to the organization to keep you here, that might not increase your salary, but you get some money in your pocket. Those are a couple of the things that I think about that could be creative solutions.
I would add to that, when we talk about non-monetary things, and I think this is super important. It's important for everyone, but I think it's super important for women, and it's always been something that's super important to me, and that's flexibility. And what flexibility, looks like, what I consider flexibility for me might be different from what Ashley considers flexibility. And that's also something that it is very, very difficult to put a dollar value to, but when you don't have it, you know it. So, definitely consider that. And also consider, because when you start talking about money and when you become disenfranchised because of your compensation, depending upon how far that goes, you might have to sort of get in the mindset that I might need to be willing to step away if this is such an issue for me. So, thinking through, how much do I enjoy my job? Do I really enjoy my job? So I can tell you, I love my job. And so is money important to me? Absolutely. Could I go somewhere else and get more? Absolutely. But because I love my group, because I love who I work with, I stay where I am. And because of the flexibility that I have, those are sort of the motivators for me. But, I would say, as we're talking about this, it is a big topic, and there are lots of different things that you want to take into consideration.
I think those are really good points. And y'all both hit on a really key topic is if you have to decide what your priority is and if it's pay or if it's flexibility. And I remember my eyes were woken up in 2008. I was working at Cohn Resnick with Debbie, and what they did, and I was thrilled because money, I needed it, but I'd rather have time off. If you know me, I would rather have time off and be outside. And they offered us less pay for more PTO. And that really, like, that was more valuable to me than them saying, here's a $5,000 bonus, so it just, or whatever the money was. So, just think about what's most important to you, because it's not always the pay that you have to worry about. What's the best way to communicate your value to these organizations?
I can start. And it's a little bit about what we talked about on the last time we were all together is how are you, tracking your accomplishments. Millie, you talked a little bit about how you were doing that in a more structured way that probably didn't land with your leader, but talking about the impact that you make and quantifying your results, like you improved efficiency or you saved X amount of money, but make sure that it's about maybe going above and beyond maybe where you're at today, or what your performance has been. And maybe you've learned a new skill and how you've put that skill at work to make a big impact. You could highlight some of the leadership or problem solving, or collaboration. Maybe you took on like an extra project. Again, some of this is kind of implied as an expectation that we'll all do everything that everyone asks us to do. But at the time, if the compensation is important, keep it a living topic with your leader. Not in an annoying way, but like, when you're getting more responsibility, it's okay to slide in. If I do really well at this, is there an opportunity to look at my compensation at the end of this? So kind of planting a seed makes it that, that's important to you. But it will become tiresome if you're bringing it up all the time. That's where, and I think Ashley and Debbie both kind of said, you might need to detach from the outcome and then just go, okay, if this isn't working, I'm going to need to do something else, because for all the reasons we talked about, it gets weird. and if your people you're negotiating with are getting weird about it, you might need to go.
I thought there was a really good comment in here. Let me find it. Y'all go ahead to the next thing. I'm kind of reading through here.
Okay, you find your comments, and just jump in, Debbie, when you find it. So when we're talking about all this and we're talking about coming prepared to ask for our raises, what's the best way to prepare in addition for our performance evaluation? And we touched on this a little bit last time, but they often go hand in hand.
Yeah. I think keeping some sort of wins tracker, like Debbie said last time, she's just got an Excel sheet. Every time you've got something going on, just throw it in an Excel sheet and make sure that you're talking about the impact that it made. Like, I did this, and here's the broader impact that it makes. Aligning your accomplishments with your job description or your strategic goals. And maybe reflect on your growth areas and where you've improved. It all goes back to, have you had a discussion with your leader about the expectations, what's expected of you, what like killing it looks like, how are you exceeding expectations? Then you've set yourself up to like anchor back to that conversation, and you've opened the door for now more pay. If you've done all those things, I think that could be really beneficial.
If you can quantify it, put a dollar value to it, that's the easiest way. Whether it's, if you're doing a deal, and this deal you were able to cut fees by 20%, those are the things that are really important. And when you can tie it to a dollar amount, it's much more difficult for an organization to push back when you say, I did this with a savings of X, of X percentage, or I did that with X percentage. Another thing to consider too is if you're in a similar role to others, what unique skills do you have that others in that same similar role, what unique skills do you have that the others in that role do not have? There's value in that as well.
Mm-hmm. And even if you lead your peers, so you have more of a leadership role, maybe you aren't like promoted at that next level, but you're taking on things that look a little bit like that next level. Those are big impacts that might not be as easily quantifiable, but still have an impact.
So one thing that I always enjoyed, well, when I was managing people, was seeing people come prepared to their evaluations. So that's very, very helpful. One of the most entertaining things to me was there was always going to be this one person, no matter what the raise bonus was, that was going to negotiate the heck out of every dollar. And then there were people that were just so grateful to get a raise, even though they probably deserved it more than the person negotiating. So should you negotiate even if you're happy with an offer? Like, how are you sending a message to the company for when they then have to reevaluate you each year?
Good question.
Yeah. I think you've got to test the waters a little bit. I would encourage you to be someone that negotiates, particularly as a woman, because I don't think we do that enough for a lot of different reasons. Um, but I think you have to also, you don't want your brand to be the person that's always going to come after the money. You can do that in a thoughtful way, but I think you can open the door to, like, if you're getting your increase, and depending on how the conversation went, like if you're hearing you did all these great things and you get 1%, like, is there room for negotiation? And you want to understand a little bit more about the decision-making process that went in there. And then you might need to evaluate, okay, I want to go after this in some ways, or here's what I'm dealing with. If you're, but kind of back to like what Debbie was talking about before, if you're feeling like I'm not being compensated fairly, I've got some data points within me that make it seem like this isn't working out. You might need to be that person to advocate for yourself a little bit more. And when the opportunity comes, knock and try to open the door to see if there's room there. And again, if there's not, for whatever reason, you might need to make some other decisions about what's important to you, and what you value, and where you need to be.
And you're right. I mean, Ashley put on here the majority of people that negotiate are men. Men have no problem, doing this whatsoever. And I do think there's a gender gap there between what men do and what they're comfortable doing and what's acceptable, and what women are comfortable doing and what is acceptable. Which is why I feel like we have to do a little more homework. We can't fly off the cuff as easily. We have to have you know, all our ducks in a row, all our data points, you know, be well prepared to get, you know, a positive outcome.
And you might get I can't right now, but let's look at it in 3 months or 6 months. You need to follow up. Then if you agree to like, we're going to look at this in the future, you own the check-in about this. Don't wait for them to come back to you, because and not that it's they're doing it on purpose, but just people get easy, and it's hard to be in a place of, I don't feel like I have a lot of control over this. You do have some control, and you can manage that timeline.
Can I flip this question a little bit on its head? So what if they sit you down after your yearly, and they say, here's what we're giving you. I mean, and it's like a slap in the face, because year after year you've been working your butt off, and they hired you in it here, and you're 6, 7 years into this, and you're just still like just ding, 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 just barely, and you're worth more. You have the metrics, you've proven yourself, and they're like, and we're going to give you this, bonus, and you're still just going, okay, you make 5 times what I make, you do shit, like what, how do you not fly off the handle in a way, but like get your point across that like I'm not like I'm not happy with this, actually. This is not acceptable. I know you're saying like negotiating, but in those moments, it literally feels like a slap in the face. And I'm maybe a little bit like not okay with that.
Well, I
So,
probably wouldn't respond that way, Millie.
I try not to, but sometimes.
And I feel pretty strongly that if you're in that position, it's time to be looking for something else anyway. And because if you feel strongly that you're worth more and the market bears it, then I think that's your answer. Depending upon, all the other factors that we've talked about.
But if you always sit there and say, oh, well, thank you very much, and or you've tried to like plant a lot of seeds and nothing's hitting, I guess at what point you're just like, can you get it across without?
Yeah, and one way to do this, because I was just thinking through, like, I know people are sitting out there thinking like, how do I negotiate? What I've never done that, right? I've gone on interviews and gotten job offers and come back before my performance review and said, okay, but I can make this here. And that way it arms you too, because if you're coming in first, can't get a job, or second, coming in at the same rate or less, then it might change your view a little bit. But I think too, Debbie and Cheryl and Millie too, tell me if I'm wrong, but some good ways to negotiate. So the ways that I've been negotiated to is, oh, I was expecting more. Oh, I'm surprised by that raise, because based on market, it should be this. And that would be all coming from men. I never had, actually, I don't think any woman ever negotiated their salary.
See, that's what we need to hear. We need to hear like that sort of like, what do you say? Because I feel like flipping over a table, and that's probably not the right answer. So I would not encourage you guys to do that. But like, what would you do?
Yeah.
Yeah, Debbie and Cheryl, how have you negotiated? How have people negotiated with you basically in your position? What is the professional way to do that so we keep Millie behaving?
I think you can easily say in a polite, non-adversarial way that I'm disappointed. I feel like my value and my contributions are worth more than that amount.
Yeah. And so that gives you the element of, I'm conveying how I feel, but I'm doing it my constrained way. And then you can say, is there room for negotiation here? And then you'll get a yes or a no. If you get well, we'll talk about it, then you can leave the conversation and get your ducks in the row. If you got a no and you're disappointed, then yeah, you might need to go do something else, or start looking. Like Ashley, I love your example, and y'all should be interviewing all the time if you can, to go, yeah, that's a great data point to see what you're worth in the organization and see what other people are doing, because we can get very comfortable in what we've got today, and if pay is okay, like just keep going at it. But it builds your skills, and you get to see what you're worth. And people react. If you bring value to the organization and they want to keep you, they will match or exceed the offer.
1000%. I tell everybody this. It costs you nothing to take a call. It costs you nothing to take a meeting. So I've always been a strong proponent of keeping those doors open. Even if you're not interested in making a move, it gives you exposure to someone else, a different organization, new people. It could be a networking thing. It could give you, depending upon how it lands, more leverage with your current employer. I've been given an offer. I really love it here. I would rather stay. This is the offer that I've gotten. Can you match it or exceed it? That's a great way to negotiate, knowing that you can walk if you want to.
Well, and flip side, right now, you all just told us, I haven't been looking right now. I'm not going to be interviewing right now, but if it's an employer's market, you may quickly realize, oh, I better, I'm going to straighten up here and stay here for a little bit, and I'm going to do my best because I don't have all these options I think I might have, right?
Exactly.
We have 3 minutes. I see this blowing up. I'm trying to keep up. If anyone wants to come off mute and say anything, please feel free. Even if you just want to share a story or share what you're doing, feel free. And we're going to beg Debbie and Cheryl to come back for number 3 of the series. But anyone want to share anything from what you've been writing? Somebody go ahead. Yeah.
One thing that I would ask is, I've sort of the opposite situation. So I'm a very small nonprofit. So whatever money I want to make, I have to raise. And I did, and I have, and we're bigger and we're doing more, and we're always every year have more and more projects and on and on. And then when I go to my board to talk about this, which is a different situation because I do not have a supervisor, I have a board, and they're sort of paying attention, but not really. And they're kind of like, yeah, you're great, you're great, you're great. And then I say, okay, well then how about if we get a bigger raise this time? And they said, no, we can't. That's too much. I mean, just the number was too much. And then I'm like, okay, so I don't have any reason why not, except that number was too high. So
Are you the ED?
yes.
I would ask to be paid based on my wins. I want a percentage of what I bring in.
Okay.
It's a good one, Debbie.
So if you're bringing in, I mean, you just talked about, and I've said this to other people many, many times, because, nonprofits are historically lower paying. So at an ED level, that's really where you can increase your compensation. Say, fine, don't increase my base. I want 5% of everything I bring in, or 10%, or whatever that number is. Because if you don't bring in anything, you're not getting anything, and that's no skin off the board's nose, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, I would say, and yeah, like keep a base salary and ask for that. I would also say, I don't know if you've ever done this, but 990s are public. Pull them and go see what people are making with your revenue or your size organization, and use that as like your baseline to start that
I
negotiation.
have one more thing. If you're having any sort of like issues and maybe you weren't comfortable today talking about it, guess what? Juan now has a podcast called Asking for a Friend. And if you go on the website and go to the Juancast section, you can put in an anonymous question, whether it's an HR question or just any question. And Angie Truitt and I are hosting that particular series. And we actually are reaching out to some of our HR, SHRM professionals and other professionals in the industry to get kind of like real talk answers and advice, and everything's anonymous. So again, if you weren't comfortable here today, think about doing that on any situation. But I just wanted to throw that out there too, because yeah, this has been fabulous though. Thank you.
I agree, Millie. Cheryl and Debbie, thank you so much. We're going to be respectful of everyone's time because we're at the hour. But like Millie said, anonymous questions can come in. You can also send them. We always ask for them before we invite Debbie and Cheryl on because we know everyone's excited. And we'll work those in. And Debbie and Cheryl, thank you so much. I mean, you generated so much questions, energy, conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thanks for having us, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.
You too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.